Good morning and welcome back to our Ask the Agronomist video series. I'm Kyla Watson here with Phil Long, third week in a row, a screen away. How you doing, Phil?
Doing just fine this morning.
Good, good, good. We've got a little rain this week. Even if it was just a little bit, better than nothing.
Yeah, it seems like all different sides of our Latham country, our territory is in different situations, but a good chunk of Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and parts of Wisconsin have all kind of been sitting in a dry spell. I mean, there's even some parts of Minnesota that are showing up on the drought monitor. So things have gotten a little bit dry, and so a needed rain or really over a half inch would be nice. We're not quite getting that yet, but any rain is welcome.
All right, very good. Well, it's very timely with our topic here today because a lot of farmers are concerned about the dry soils, and not just seeds imbibing water, but more so the role on how that can negatively affect the herbicides they put down.
Yeah, exactly. So many things in agriculture and farming. We take so many risks, farmers have so many decisions every year to make, and they're not necessarily cookie cutter decisions. And herbicides and planting a crop all relies on the weather. And when it comes to residual herbicides, like we're talking about today, and their role and how they keep weeds down, the weather has a big factor to play. So yeah, we've been sitting in a really, I would say, a dry spell. We put crops in, at least in Iowa. I know, looking at the stats on Iowa, we saw in about a 10-day window, we saw about 80% of corn go in the ground, and we're sitting at earlier this week at least 50% of soybeans in the ground. And several of the surrounding states are very similar in that regards, but showing up about 20% short to very short on topsoil moisture. So those are the kind of things that we look at when it comes to residual herbicides and putting those down. I've talked to a lot of growers that say they might have planted beans in dry soil conditions. We're heading into a weekend that looks like it's going to have some chilly temperatures in the forecast, and a lot of the beans aren't out of the ground, so we don't have much to worry about there. But depending on the lows that we see, some of those beans that have made it out of the ground may potentially see some damage depending how low we see those lows go. But the other thing is, like you were talking, the moisture in the topsoil and that seeding depth. I've dealt with questions on how deep can I plant? Excuse me, how deep can I plant to get that seed to imbibe water? Soybeans take up water really well, but we've talked about it before previously. We don't want to push them much over 2 inches, or you get really uneven emergence. So, keeping those things in mind. But yeah, today's topic of residual herbicides is a good one, and it's good to keep at the front of your mind because right now a lot of residual herbicides have gone down or are going down, and are they going to work or not?
Mm-hmm. So let's just talk real quick before we jump there. Why are residual herbicides even important?
Sure. So residual herbicides are to me very important because they're critical to kind of decreasing our dependence on in season or post or contact herbicides. Contact herbicides tend to take a lot of the brunt of the resistance pressure because number one, you got to get good coverage. That's really important when it comes to a lot of contact and even some systemic, but good coverage is very important, which sometimes is a challenge. So a residual herbicide or soil applied herbicide is put down before the crop or at planting shortly after, depending on the herbicide, put down in the soil. And basically what it does is it gets in soil solution and stays in that water so that when those little weed seedlings germinate, they take that up and die off. So really it creates kind of a window from before planting, sometimes two or a couple weeks, well past when the crop emerges. So it gives us a window of time that we can control those weeds before the crop canopies. So typically we'll have to do a post application of something. That's why we have so many different options on the soybean side for in-season post control of some of the troublesome weeds. But it really gives us a better chance to get those weeds when they're small. So if we have poor performance from residual herbicides, or we don't put a residual herbicide down, we end up battling weeds that are as tall or taller than the crop in the field. And that really becomes a challenge. That's why our residual herbicides are so important.
Okay, very good. So what does the role of dry soils play into the effectiveness of our residual herbicides?
Sure. So typically what you see on a herbicide, residual herbicide label, you'll see something to the general effect of, requires a half inch of rain within 7 to 10 days or 2 weeks or whatever it would say, to get that herbicide in solution, soil solution in the water so that it can be effective. Otherwise, it's not activated essentially. So other options are, a lot, especially back when we used more prowl and things like that, is incorporation or shallow incorporation with tillage. However, if you're in no-till or trying to do reduced tillage, especially on soybeans, there's a lot more soybeans in reduced tillage situations than corn. That makes it a challenge. You don't want to go out there and run a field cultivator just to work in a herbicide. So it makes it a little bit of a challenge when you don't get those rains. And if we're sitting in as dry soil conditions as we are right now, that means that herbicide is not doing its job. So when the residual herbicide gets sprayed on the field and you have dry soil conditions, what happens, or what should happen, I'll start with that. What should happen is it's going to go into an equilibrium, we'll call it, of some of that herbicide is bound to the soil and some of it stays in the water, or the solution. So when that seedling, that weed seedling emerges, germinates, it's going to absorb that water, to grow, and it's going to die because there's enough of that toxic compound from the herbicide in it to kill it off. However, if we're in dry soil conditions, there's not going to be enough water. There's not going to be enough water to create some of those herbicide molecules to be in the water for that seedling to imbibe or take up to grow. So you end up with more herbicide bound to the soil. And that's not a good thing because basically it's not activated, it's not there, it's not able to do the job that it's supposed to in the role of getting taken up by that seedling. So that's why a lot of times you'll see things that say, basically plan on doing other control measures if you don't get that rain within a 2 week period or whatnot. So you can end up in kind of a challenging situation when you put down potentially a fairly expensive, control measure for those weeds. So, it's heavily reliant on the weather to do that. The other thing I would note on this is this all, when you think about how herbicides move in the soil, farmers should always think about when they look at a label. One of the things that always pops out to me is that percent organic matter. So a couple of the things that are most important when it comes to herbicides is the percent organic matter, and then your texture. I'll call it the soil texture. So your percent sand, clay, and silt. So those things, as well as your CEC and pH, are also usually factored in on that label to give you an idea how hard it's going to be, or how much extra herbicide you have to put down to make that into solution. So if you have a lot of, just a quick example, if you have really high organic matter, which creates high CEC, so 4 or 5% organic matter, you've got a good clay content, you got really high CEC, you're going to have to put more herbicide down because more of that soil, that negative charge in the soil is stronger. It's going to potentially hold that herbicide more tightly and not let it go into solution. So that's why that relationship between those plays into it. The pH side of things is more on breakdown. We talk about that a lot with like atrazine, things like that affect how quickly the herbicide breaks down at certain pHs. It may stick around longer, may stay in solution, or it may be bound to the soil longer. So all those things play into the role of whether or not a herbicide is effective in the soil. But first and foremost, when it comes to residual herbicides, is getting a good rain in order to get that into solution and being able to do what it's intended to do.
Mm-hmm. So if farmers get past that 7 to 10 day waiting period for the rain, when would you say is time to be looking at Plan B?
Obviously, if you've already got the herbicide down, that's probably going to be the first thought in their mind. Okay, it's already out there. I've already got the beans planted or corn, whatever it is. You've already got that herbicide down. So you're really waiting on that rain. If you don't get that rain, then obviously you need to be thinking in your mind, okay, I may need to move up that post application a little more than I wanted to because my residual herbicide is not going to be as effective. So the plan B would be making sure that you're paying attention to those fields that you've got that herbicide on that aren't going to be, that you're not going to have as good a weed control. So getting out there in season a little bit earlier to control those weeds, because we have a lot of technologies we talk about in beans on the soybean side, but the challenge with that isn't gaining resistance, is not getting the weeds when they're the right size. So if we wait and we say, okay, that early season residual herbicide did not do its job, I'll get it at the same time I always do, maybe middle of June. Those weeds are going to be as tall or taller in the crop. We're going to have a challenge with controlling them. There will be weed escapes, and then that's how we get those resistant weeds the next following year. So those go to seed, and then we end up with lots of little weed seedlings that aren't as affected by that herbicide that we so desperately rely on. So that's the number one key, is keeping an eye on those fields. If we're not getting that rain within that window that states on the label, we need to pay attention to those fields.
Okay, very good. Well, is there anything else that you would like to add this morning?
Final thought, obviously, I mentioned it up front, but shallow incorporation can be a helpful thing in times like this. However, you gotta weigh those options. Is it going to make it drier? Is it going to, for seed, if you're still planting, things like that. But shallow incorporation, as long as it's shallow, can be a good thing and help activate that herbicide and get it in the solution. So.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you for joining us this morning. We appreciate it. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Have a good day.